As we're coming on the air, the world is condemning Vladimir Putin for a big escalation in the conflict with Ukraine because he's now saying he's going to recognize parts of Ukraine as independent. That's being seen as the potential start of the next chapter in this crisis, the possible pretext for war that has the U.S. so worried, with President Biden announcing new plans for sanctions, and he's not the only one. We're live at the White House and in Kyiv to talk next steps. Also breaking tonight, in the hands of a jury, the decision in a federal hate crimes case against the three men who murdered Ahmaud Arbery. The new emotional reaction from Arbery's mother coming up. Plus, the UK lifting all of its pandemic restrictions tonight, right as we're learning Queen Elizabeth has tested positive for COVID. We'll talk about why some scientists are pushing back, as here in the U.S., some parents are taking extreme measures to get rid of mask mandates in their schools. And a new study shows millions of American kids have gone back into poverty because the child tax credit has expired. We're going to hear from one mother who's trying to get by, hoping for help from Washington. And later in the show, lawmakers in New Hampshire may roll back the state's ban on LGBTQ conversion therapy for kids. The story of one survivor of this so-called treatment in tonight's original. Hey, I'm Hallie, and tonight we're coming on the air with what is very clearly an inflection point. And this is why. You're seeing it right here in some of the video we're about to show you. Russian President Vladimir Putin signing a document to formally recognize two regions in eastern Ukraine as independent. Basically, he's slicing off, or trying to, part of the country that's mostly controlled by pro-Russian separatists. It's like the red parts of the map that you're looking at right now. These are areas that are part of Ukraine. 2 million people live there. And let's be clear, they are not part of Russia. They are not independent. But experts think Putin is making this declaration of independence for them to spin up a reason to go to war, basically to say an invasion is necessary to save them. And you know Putin's message is very clearly aimed at the West. After all, he gave this speech at something like 10 o'clock at night Russia time after a day of wall-to-wall coverage of his national security meeting on Russian state TV there. President Biden huddling with his own national security team and ready to issue what the White House says will be an executive order targeting those regions, separate from tougher sanctions the administration says it'll put in place if Russia actually does go to war. And if Russia actually does go to war, if that's what this is, the run-up to it, NBC News has learned the White House has talked about Ukraine's President Zelensky and a possible exit plan for him to get out of the country. Officials for Zelensky and the National Security Council deny those conversations took place. But we know Zelensky talked with President Biden today. And just in, the president's still working the phone with European allies. He just got off a call with Germany's Olaf Scholz and France's Emmanuel Macron. There's a lot going on, and it all happened really in just the last couple hours. We're going to get the latest from Moscow with Matt Bodner in a sec. But let me start with Mike Memoli over at the White House. And Mem, listen, this recognition is a big escalation. It is a huge, it's more than a poke in the eye from Putin, and it's something that the White House saw coming. Just within the last week, we heard from Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who said if, in fact, Putin does make this recognition, it would mean a swift and firm response from the U.S. Tell me what you're seeing and hearing behind the scenes at the White House tonight.
Well, Hallie, you're right to point out that this is something that the White House had been forecasting, and that's why two things are true at the moment. One is the White House is very clearly concerned that Vladimir Putin has taken this step. You see this in the flurry of phone calls the president is making today. You see it in yet another meeting of his top National Security Council officials, all at the White House today after also meeting over the weekend. But the reason I say two things are true is because the White House on some level has been not gratified, but pointing to the fact that all of the predictions that we've heard from the Secretary of State at the UN last week and from other officials on the air and in public settings over the course of the last week have come true. They have been determined not to let Vladimir Putin go through an exercise which they see as a charade, as a pretext for war, without calling them out frequently and publicly. And that's exactly what is happening here. Now, whether that makes a difference, whether that brings Putin back from the brink, whether that pressure has complicated his next play, remains to be seen. But very clearly, Hallie, this long simmer we've been talking about is very close to a boil, and that's definitely being portrayed by the White House today.
I don't want to press the analogy, Mike, but it's already boiling, right? What we're seeing now is like, does it go over the pot? Or, I mean, there's like no good analogy for it, but this is like, it's happening, right? It's very real. Can I have you stand by for 1 second, Memoli? Because we're getting some breaking news in from our colleague, Matt Bodner, who we're going to pull up on screen and split with you there in Moscow. Matt, I don't want to get this wrong, so I'm going to let you take it. The latest on what we are hearing now, just coming into us literally in the last 5 minutes from Russia. Go.
Thank you, Hallie. Well, so in the document that President Putin signed at the end of his big speech today, in the same room as the two separatist leaders, that's, I think, a critical detail to keep in mind here. At the very bottom of it is an order for the Russian armed forces to move in and assume peacekeeping operations. So we're just hearing about this now. There was no fanfare on that point during the entire ceremony. This is something people started to notice after, once the document was actually published. Though we were hearing some signals from Russian lawmakers, for example, that there was like a 100% chance that Russian troops would now go in to assume a peacekeeping role. So now we have it. It's official, and we'll see if they stay in those not recognized, the claimed borders, the line of contact, if you will, between the Ukrainian military and the region of Luhansk and Donetsk that the rebels have staked out for 8 years now.
Okay, Matt, I'm going to ping pong back to Mem here for a second, so you stand by. Now, Mem, if in fact Putin does put these peacekeeping, let me say, quote unquote, peacekeeping troops in these regions, what does that trigger as far as the U.S. response and the response from our allies overseas?
Well, this has been the main question, right? Because one person's peacekeeper is another person's invasion. And we have been very careful with our language as we've been asking questions to the White House, and they've been very careful with theirs. What constitutes an invasion? And Russian troops crossing into Ukraine territory has been the line that they've drawn. And so we've already seen a version of what could be coming in terms of a more forceful response from this White House in simply reacting earlier today to the designation of these territories as independent by the Russian president. You saw within very close time period the White House issue a statement saying that sanctions are coming, and you also saw the head of the European Union saying sanctions will be coming, and that is separate and apart from the larger sanctions package that the West has been threatening throughout this process. So White House officials are briefing reporters at this very moment, and so you can expect when we're able to share more of what those officials are saying, we might have even more to say about how they're viewing this next step. But we also just got in the last, literally, this is one of those days, Hallie, where we're looking up and down at our phones as we're talking to you. The White House just issued a readout of the president's phone calls with the German chancellor and the French president, making it clear that those conversations are ongoing. And I'll read from part of it. As they say in the statement, independent is in quotes. They discuss how they will continue to coordinate their next steps.
Okay, Matt, let me go to you for a second, because, first of all, very quickly, we don't know, in fact. So what you are reporting is that this document that Putin signed, and correct me if I'm about to mischaracterize your reporting, but you're saying the document that Putin signed includes a provision that would order Russian troops into these regions that he has declared as independent, quote unquote, for peacekeeping purposes. Do we know if those troops have actually followed through on that order yet?
That I do not know offhand. Suffice to say that they would have had to move very quickly.
Let me pull back up the map that we've been showing, and Mike, you know this as well, but Matt, we're showing the region, right? We're showing these places that we're talking about, Luhansk and Donetsk. These are areas where you've seen images coming from. They've been the subject of shelling for the last week. Again, a lot of concern from U.S. officials that Putin was using this all as a pretext for war. There is now concern, and Matt, I'll go to you on this, from experts, that Putin may have his eyes, if he does in fact invade. Pull that map up for just one more second. On the area, on the right side of your screen, from those two separatist-held territories, you see them in red there, all the way down to Crimea, which, of course, Putin invaded and annexed back in 2014, that perhaps Putin is looking to gain control of more territory to essentially gain a strategic advantage into Ukraine. Matt Bodner.
So this idea, has been there for a long time. I think, the main reason for concern right now is Vladimir Putin's speech. He laid out the case that Ukraine isn't really a modern state.
You described it as an extraordinary speech.
Or even a traditional state. An extraordinary speech, absolutely. I stand by those words. I mean, we've not seen anything like that from him before. I mean, he wrote an essay last summer that was getting there, but I mean, he just got on national television. This was across the Russian state media on multiple networks. And he said things like, modern Ukraine was created by Russia. He had this really shocking statement where he kind of described the process by which essentially the Bolsheviks created Ukraine. Ukraine was part of the collapse of the Soviet Union and has gone through this process of decommunization, saying, well, let's go all the way. We can help you with that. Basically like That's a threat. I don't, linking your state's creation to the communist period and saying you're basically part of the process of the collapse of the Soviet Union and have done everything you can to rid yourself of communism. I mean, you see the logic here? It's a threat, and basically he just kept hitting these historical grievances that all amount to you don't exist, you should not exist, we built you, and we're going to start addressing some of these historical grievances. So right now, the concern is he's started with the recognition of these two breakaway statelets. He's already kind of made it clear he doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the Ukrainian state. In fact, characterizing it as captured by foreign modes of government that are not native to the region was one of the parts of this speech, and this is why I called it extraordinary. Yeah, so I think really the only main takeaway from this is that Vladimir Putin has made the case, if he so chooses to act on it, for further incursion into Ukraine from here. So I don't think we can really, look at it any other way.
Yeah. Memoli, the White House knows this. The White House sees this and sees these signals and has a team in place that knows Vladimir Putin, that understands the dynamics at play here. I want to be clear that the economic sort of price that they're looking to have Putin pay relates specifically what they're doing in this executive order that they just announced to those regions, right? It's not to Russia as a whole, not yet. It is separate and apart from that. That's an important distinction. Can you give me this? I'm going to be really honest with you, Mem. I know this is kind of an annoying question that I'm about to ask you, right? And it's one that reporters kind of roll their eyes at. But it's a little bit about what it's like behind the scenes at the White House, because this is a significant moment for President Biden. He is about to take, to the microphone at the U.S. Capitol in about a week here and give a State of the Union speech while dealing with this major foreign policy crisis that experts say needs American leadership. He's now had 2 days in a row where he's huddled, as we're seeing pictures from the White House, with his national security team. To say that tensions are high is an understatement, and he has been on the phone, best as I can tell, since about 2 o'clock this afternoon with allies and leaders from around the world. This is a significant moment for this West Wing.
It's a heck of a way to spend a President's Day, I will add, Hallie Jackson, that this president has been so immersed in this issue for his entire career. When you think about, as a senator on the Foreign Relations Committee at a time when the Cold War, during especially the Reagan years, was the #1 overarching foreign policy challenge facing the United States, facing the West. And so this moment behind the scenes for the administration has been one, certainly as an opportunity to show the kind of competence, the steadiness that the president ran on, frankly, and promised, and one which, by the way, even our allies felt was missing during the Afghanistan withdrawal. There was concern that allies were not being consulted enough in the lead up, and certainly in the days that followed the Taliban takeover of Kabul. You're not hearing the same thing now. You are seeing the president engaging every lever of power of every alliance that he can pull at this moment. And that's really the thing that White House officials are underscoring to me constantly, is just how much this president knows the game that Putin is playing, and they are trying to match him with every chess piece that he moves, and doing so, just as we saw, as quickly as possible. That's why one of the big questions, based on how this continues to escalate, is we've seen a lot of Vladimir Putin today. Do we see President Biden at any point today?
Think there's still a chance for that, Mike? It's 5:13 Eastern time right now.
I don't believe we've gotten a lid, and in fact, as you would know, it's called the call time has been pushed back, which is essentially the start of the day rather than the end of the day. So this is something the White House hasn't taken off the table yet in terms of a presidential speech today. I remember how quickly it came up on the agenda on Friday when we eventually heard from him Friday afternoon, and so this is something that they reserve the right to have him speak. But for now, it's administration officials doing the talking behind the scenes.
Mike Memoli, live for us outside the White House. Matt Bodner, live in Moscow. One of those nights we're ripping up the rundown. Thank you both for rolling with us on that breaking news. Appreciate it. We've got more breaking news, too, tonight. The federal hate crimes case for the killers of Ahmaud Arbery is now in the hands of a jury as of, I think, only about an hour and a half ago. Travis McMichael, his father, Gregory McMichael, and William Brody Bryan were convicted of murder and sentenced to life for killing Arbery, remember. Well, now they're standing trial federally for whether race played a role in why they did it. It was an emotional day in the courtroom for these closing arguments. Arbery's mother crying while the prosecution explained, in their view, how the defendants chased down and murdered her son because he was black. Well, the men's defense attorneys claim their client was not motivated by race, but tried to protect a neighborhood that had a recent history of break-ins in which they believed Arbery was involved. Travis and Gregory McMichael are each charged with interference with Arbery's rights, attempted kidnapping, and using, carrying, and brandishing, and in Travis's case, discharging a firearm during and in relation to a violent crime. William Roddy Bryan also charged with interference with rights and attempted kidnapping. Outside court today, you heard from Arbery's mother saying she is hopeful for a verdict that, in her view, amounts to justice. Watch.
I think the DOJ presented the case well, and I think we're going to get a good verdict at the end. Very emotional. This has been very draining, and I'm thankful that it's almost over.
Joining me now from Atlanta is Blaine Alexander, who's covering this one. So, Blaine, we know that the jury now has the case. We are officially on verdict watch for this, right?
Yeah.
And you saw in these closing arguments, let me start with the prosecution today, reminding the jury of some of the racist statements that the defendants made. He actually said he couldn't go through all of them because there were too many to list. Talk about their strategy in the closing.
Well, Hallie, they wanted to give what they call a window into the defendant's mindset. You know, one of the things that really stood out to me during the prosecution's closing arguments, she said that the defendants associated black skin with criminality. So basically, she's trying to make the argument that they already had their minds made up about Ahmaud Arbery when he came running by that day because of what they thought about black people. So that was the case they've been trying to build, that they thought of them as subhuman or made slurs or said that they were no good or dangerous people. She says all of that essentially amounts to the fact that, in the prosecution's view, that they already had their minds made up about Ahmaud Arbery and that they were motivated by race.
Talk about the defense then, right? Because they were saying, they were fairly adamant that the slurs used by their clients were, in their view, nothing to be proud of. Did the response, you know, I know that there's only a limited number of people in the courtroom. Did the response land with the jury, do we think?
You know, it's a good question, and it's something they really tried to point out. They didn't run from it. They didn't try and defense it because they said that it's reprehensible. There is no defense for that type of language. They said that in the opening statements and again in the closing, but they made the point that their personal beliefs are not what's on trial here. Now, they also gave some individual defenses, saying, for instance, that Greg McMichael, there's no evidence that he ever used a racial slur. He only went on racist rants about black people. Or Travis McMichael said them in kind of private company with people who shared his same views, so nobody was pushing back. But again, they say that that is not what's on trial, and they say that it didn't meet the burden of proof to show that that is actually what motivated their actions that day.
This is all part of a broader conversation, Blaine. We heard the emotional, response from Ahmaud Arbery's mom there. This is a community that has been through so much recently.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, I really think that the timing plays a role in this as well. And it's certainly a very notable timing. This Wednesday marks the second anniversary of Arbery's death. And it's something that his mother actually spoke to when she spoke to cameras today. When she talked to reporters, she said, that makes it more meaningful for her. And she hopes to get what she calls a good verdict by this second anniversary, by this Wednesday. Hallie.
Blaine Alexander live for us in Atlanta. Blaine, thank you for being there for us. I know you're staying close to a camera in case we get any news on that. Huge pandemic milestone over in the UK today, lifting all the rest of its COVID restrictions. People there don't have to isolate if they test positive starting on Thursday. Free testing's also going away in April. And they've already gotten rid of mask requirements, even though those are still in place in other parts of Europe. Prime Minister Boris Johnson today saying he thinks his country is ready for this next stage.
This virus is not going away, but it is the day when all the efforts of the last 2 years finally enabled us to protect ourselves whilst restoring our liberties in full.
Keep in mind the backdrop to all of this, coming just about 24 hours after we learned that Queen Elizabeth has tested positive for COVID. She's 95 years old, remember. Buckingham Palace says she's experiencing some mild cold-like symptoms, in their words, but she'll keep up her light duties this week. Let me bring in Raf Sanchez here with me now. So, Raf, let me start with the lifting of all those restrictions there over the next several weeks and months in the UK. 300 scientists in an open letter say this is too early. They say this is a politicized pandemic response where you are. So why now for Boris Johnson?
Boris Johnson will tell you that it is time to learn to live with the virus. The same argument, Hallie, that you're hearing from governors in both blue states and red states in the U.S. The virus is not going away. We need to find an accommodation with it. And it's time to relegate it from something that has completely turned our lives upside down for 2 years to something more like the flu, where the individual, rather than the government, makes the decisions about their health and what they're going to do if they get infected infected with the coronavirus. Now, the Prime Minister argues he has the science on his side also. He points to the very high vaccination rates here in England. 81% of adults here in England have had their booster shot, let alone being double vaccinated. He says that gives him confidence to move ahead. But exactly as you said, there is a lot of concern about this, especially for people who have weakened immune systems and what they're going to do if the restrictions come off and rates shoot up and the virus is everywhere again. Hallie?
And there's this COVID headline is coming on the heels of another big COVID headline in the UK, which is, of course, where you are outside Buckingham Palace, the Queen testing positive for COVID. I know, Raf, that they've said that she's fully vaccinated. We don't really know if that means she's been boosted. Any update at this point on how she's doing?
Hallie, we've talked about this before. The British monarchy is not a particularly transparent institution, especially when it comes to the Queen's health, right? So the line from palace officials is they are not going to give a running commentary on this. And what that means is we haven't had any official update since yesterday when they first told us that she tested positive. As you said, yesterday they told us she is facing mild cold-like symptoms and that she's going to continue with what they call light duties at Windsor Castle. Now, we understand that to mean she's going to be on the phone with Prime Minister Boris Johnson later in the week. The Queen and the Prime Minister meet once a week, either virtually or in person. It's obviously going to be virtually this time. We think she may do a couple of virtual events with foreign ambassadors who are handing over their credentials. But we really don't have a good sense of what kind of treatment the Queen is getting. We don't have a strong sense of how she's feeling. And the palace has been criticized a couple of times in the last few months for really not telling us very much about the Queen's health, which is a subject of massive interest both here in the UK and around the world. Hallie?
Sure is. Raf Sanchez, thank you very much for that. Good to see you live. Appreciate it. In this country, when you talk about the pandemic, there's this story out now on how some people against mask mandates are going to pretty extreme measures to try and get rid of them. NBC News found this group called Bonds for the Wind, organizing parents to file claims against school districts' insurance policies. You think, okay, well, why? What's up with that? The claims would have no legal standing, but they flood schools with tons of legal paperwork. It makes it confusing. It wastes the resources of school districts, ties them up. School state parents are using these as scare tactics, basically, as a strategy to force them to change their policies on masks, on books, and more. And it's happening all over the country in at least 14 states. You've got these so-called activists, some of whom are also QAnon conspiracy followers, our team have found, who have tried to serve some sham paperwork to school districts. In some places, it's gotten so bad, police had to get involved. Ben Collins is reporting this for us tonight. And Ben, our loyal viewers will know you as one of our rabbit hole dystopian tunnelers, if you will. And you have emerged from that world with this new, this conspiracy theory that has taken on a life of its own, something that critics call paper terrorism. Explain how this idea of paper terrorism works.
Yeah, it's sort of this unholy alliance of QAnon supporters and anti-vaxxers and the anti-critical race theory crowd. They've kind of combined it into one big thing. Paper terrorism is the idea that you are serving so many lawsuits, whether they be real or fake. In this case, they're all fake. They're all citing things like the Nuremberg Code instead of U.S. law, that you inundate public agencies with this stuff. And they have no choice but to take it seriously. They have no choice but to act on it in some capacity. And that's what we're seeing all throughout the country. We talked to this one school district in Illinois where teachers were like, are we going to get paid next week? Is that going to happen? Because they were served with this paperwork from these QAnon supporters where they thought they were going to get their federal funding taken away. They thought the school district was going to be bankrupted. But really, it's just a conspiracy theory pushed hyper locally, but centralized through web apps like Telegram.
Where did this get? I mean, you're talking about where this got born, if you will. Talk about the people behind it, right, and their goals for this whole thing.
Yeah, the major people behind it are this woman named Mickey Klan, who is a flat earther who believes that AIDS is a hoax. She combined with Ron Watkins, who's probably Q from QAnon. He owns 8chan. And, together they've pushed this thing into the ether. They have a 70,000 person Telegram group with chapters in every single state. And in 14 different states, they've already filed a bunch of this paperwork. It serves to intimidate anybody who doesn't know what's about to happen. And really, that should be anyone. This is not a common thing that takes place. This is frequently done just to scare people into, banning a book they don't like or getting rid of a mask mandate sooner than they would have previously. The idea is to get people to buckle, not to win a lawsuit.
How do school districts fight this? What are they supposed to do? Because this, as we said, sucks up resources. It sucks up time. It freaks people out when this happens.
Yeah, I mean, knowledge is power here, definitely, more than anything. You have to know that if you're getting a lawsuit that's 50 to 100 pages long and it cites like the commercial code or something and not U.S. law, that it's probably not real. Obviously, bring it through a lawyer and everything. But what they do is they go to school board meetings. They give a big speech about how communism is taking over the schools and how there are books about pedophilia and all this stuff, and they hand out the papers during that. And sometimes they're addressed directly to school board members, which scares them because this is a multi-million-dollar lawsuit on a random private citizen in some town in the United States. So if you know that this is coming, if you understand this is a tactic by the far right now, it might save you a little bit of agita in the long run.
Ben Collins live for us with that. I commend folks, of course, as always, to read your work on NBCnews.com. Ben, thank you. Coming up here on the show, child poverty is up more than 40%. You know what that means? Millions more kids have gone back into poverty after the monthly child tax credit ended in December. Some parents are begging Washington to help. Please, you're going to meet a mom who says losing that money has already put her in a financial hole. So this new study shows child poverty spiked big time in January. We're talking about a 41% increase from December of last year. And let me stop talking about the numbers. Let me put this into perspective for you. That means nearly 4 million more kids, nearly 4 million more children have gone back into poverty after they were lifted out of it thanks to the expanded child tax credit. However, those monthly payments ended in December. So now you are seeing some parents who are hoping that Washington steps in to help them again, please. Hallie Vitale spoke with one mom who's struggling to make ends meet. Watch.
Every paycheck, I am $100 overdrawn. If I want to put food in the house, that's my situation.
Katrina Ross is a single mom of 3. Losing the expanded child tax credit meant losing a critical lifeline for essentials like healthy groceries and gas for her car.
That $300 a month took a lot of stress off of me of wondering how am I going to get food in the house and pay the electric bill and the gas bill. I paid the bills coming out of Christmas, and I had to ask a friend to loan me money to get food for the house.
The Rosses are just one of more than 36 million families impacted by the expiration of the child tax credit, which gave most families with kids ages 6 to 17 $250 per child each month, while families like Katrina's with kids under 6 received $300 monthly. Despite praise for how the program would cut child poverty by half, according to Columbia University, Congress couldn't come to consensus on how to extend it before the end of last year. So the checks stopped coming. The child tax credit foundering along with President Biden's signature social and climate spending package. Still, some lawmakers hoping to revive the benefit.
Now, why would we want to pull that rug out from under them and say, you're now again on your own? It is a cruel hoax.
In the meantime, data shows the stark realities of life without those monthly checks. A new study showing 3.7 million more kids in poverty in January, the month after the checks stopped coming. Black and Latino children saw the biggest spikes. So while Washington tries to work on a fix, families like Katrina's are left to wait.
I would just really ask anyone who's stalling on this and holding it up or pushing it to the back burner to not. You're put there to speak for us, and the families that need it, they're asking you to speak for us.
Hallie Vitale is joining us now with more on her reporting. Hallie, we're so glad that you are bringing those stories to us because they're really important. I was doing some reporting on this well before this ended up law, right? Well before the monthly child tax credits went into effect. And I was talking with a top Democrat working on this who said, hey, once it's in, because I said, well, what happens if it expires, right? And the argument was, well, once it's in, it's going to be so hard to get rid of it because you're going to see all these people lifted out of poverty. Well, guess what? Flash forward. That's exactly the situation that a lot of folks are in. So what happens now for these families? You laid it out in the piece. It looks like an uphill battle. What are the chances it gets revived? What is on the table?
I'm so glad that you pointed out what the mentality was here on the Hill, because the thinking around a lot of the things in Build Back Better, including and especially around the child tax credit, was people are going to benefit from this so much, it's going to be a no-brainer for Congress to keep it going. What actually ended up happening is that this fell apart along with the rest of Build Back Better, and in terms of bringing it back, there are people up here who want to do that. You saw the folks on the left side of this aisle, both in the House and the Senate, in that press conference there. There is some momentum for it on the right, although people like Senator Mitt Romney are putting forward plans in earnest and in the early stages right now that include things like strict work requirements, as well as some reforms to the tax code that might make it hard for Democrats to get on board. But when you talk about things like strict work requirements, that's something that Senator Joe Manchin wanted to see in this, and part of the reason why, along with the whole list of other reasons that we know why he tanked Build Back Better, that's one of the things that he wants to see in this in regards to specifically the child tax credit. So whether or not it means that it gets revived, that's sort of the open question here, but it looks like specifically on this, it could be done as a standalone bill in bipartisan fashion. At least that's what some lawmakers are trying to do. But again, the idea that it was a no-brainer, made sense on paper, didn't exactly play out in reality.
What would be the timeline if it does get revived, Al?
There is no timeline right now, because people like Romney, who are trying to work on this from the Republican side and then work in bipartisan fashion across the aisle with the left, they're doing those conversations in the early phases at this point. Even just last week, when Romney was talking about this with reporters, he said that he wasn't ready to name the Democrats, and no Democrats are wildly raising their hands saying that they're on board with the Republican plan on this. So if they're not putting their names on it, you know that you're not even in terms of a timeline of like a few weeks from now or a few months. You know how slowly Congress moves. And, you know, if you don't have names, it's even harder to put a timeline on it.
Hallie, Vitaly, thank you so much for bringing us that reporting. I appreciate it. Yep. Coming up, if you think gas prices are high now, well, they could spike even more if Russia invades Ukraine. And those may not be the only energy prices going up. We're heading back to our top story with Tom Costello joining us next. Plus, it's a bittersweet day for some millennials. Why Arthur has so many people nostalgic for their childhood. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, British music entrepreneur and YouTube star Jamal Edwards has died at the age of 31. Edwards was behind the online music platform SBTV, which helped launch the careers of people like Ed Sheeran, Jessie J. Edwards' mother says he died suddenly Sunday morning of an illness. Number 2, the Coast Guard in Greece says it rescued a survivor from the back of a ferry Sunday that had caught fire and is still burning. It's Italian-owned. It was on its way to Italy. Officials say more than 280 people have been rescued so far. 10 people are still missing. Number 3, check out these emotional reunions in Australia. That's after they opened up to international tourists and to business travelers today. There's still some restrictions, but nothing like some of the pretty tough border policies Australia has had in place the last couple years. You see people hugging, you see people really emotionally getting reunited. You saw an accordion, I think, too. Clearly some celebration, there it is, happening at the airport. Number 4, something like 400 Family Dollar stores are closing down temporarily after an FDA investigation found a rodent infestation at a distribution center in Arkansas. Now, Family Dollar is recalling some of the products that ship from that facility to hundreds of stores down south. And number 5, have you heard about this? Arthur coming to an end with the last episodes out today. This is the longest running kids animated series in history. But if you're of a certain age, I probably don't even have to tell you that. The show stars 8-year-old Aardvark Arthur, his family, his friends. It's been running for 25 years, expanding to music, to games, to toys, to social media memes. Luckily, you can still watch it if you want on PBS Kids. As we told you at the top of the show, the possibility of Russia invading Ukraine, at least for U.S. officials that our teams are talking to, seems to be potentially more a matter of when, not if. And even though any invasion would happen thousands of miles away, could still cost us here at home as it relates to the price of gas, food, other stuff that could go up even more. Vice President Kamala Harris has said the White House is going to try to help. Watch.
Maybe we will incur some cost. And in this situation, that may relate to energy costs, for example. But we are taking very specific and appropriate, I believe, steps to mitigate what that cost might be if it happens.
Okay, so let's put this into some hard numbers for you. You are looking at the average price of gas, according to AAA, $3.53. Some predict that if there were to be an invasion and this domino effect were to happen, you could see gas prices go up something like 30 cents a gallon. Think about that for some place like California, where gas is already close to $5. Tom Costello is joining us now. Tom, it's great to see you. You are posted up, I think, at a gas station out there in Bethesda, and you talked to people today about the gas prices. It was inflation first, now the crisis in Ukraine. What are you hearing?
It's really starting to bite, right? And we're not just talking about you and me and friends of ours who may pump gas. We're talking about small business owners as well. I talked to a guy who owns a chain of pizza stores in the Northeast up in New England. He's got 300 of them already. And he said, listen, it's not just gas prices. He has to fill his delivery trucks and his small cars, the drivers that deliver your pizza, but all of the incoming stuff into him, all of the ingredients. Prices have skyrocketed over the last year. And so for the first time in history, he's had to raise prices 4 times in the last year because of food prices, supply chain, and now the fuel prices. You know, you talked about the fact that we could see prices over $4 a gallon nationally. And the expectation is we will see gas prices already pushing $5 in California, going to $6 if, in fact, we have a full invasion. So that starts to cause real pain at the pump, and people simply curtail everything. They don't go out to eat, and those small business owners are really affected.
The obvious solve for this, right, big picture, Tom, would be like for Putin not to invade, like not to go to war, right? Realistically, though, what are things that the administration can do, the Biden administration? What are things that can be done on the federal level to be able to try to get a handle on some of this?
You know, their options really are kind of limited here, right? Today, Senator Blumenthal of Connecticut, was one of several Democrats who came out calling for a suspension of the federal gas tax, 18 cents a gallon. If you cut that back, he says, if we suspend it for the rest of the year, that becomes real money in people's pockets. Okay, but that's 18 cents, likely to be offset, as you can imagine, by rising prices. In addition, you could tap the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Here's the problem. We're already at 20-year lows on the SPR, and the SPR is meant for an emergency like we're being invaded or we're going to war. So if you tap that now, and God forbid this thing with Russia gets out of control, you don't have your backup supplies, right? You got 580 million barrels sitting in that SPR right now. So the administration's options here are really kind of limited. And as we say every single time we're out doing a major story about gas prices, oil prices, this is an oil market, a global oil market. Prices are set globally, not locally, not nationally. What happens in Europe and in the Middle East and in Ukraine matters to all of us.
Such a good point and an important one. Tom Costello live for us there. Tom, thank you very much. Coming up here on the show, New Hampshire is looking to repeal its ban on conversion therapy. Advocacy groups say it's a dangerous move that could put LGBTQ teens at a higher risk of dying by suicide. How one conversion therapy survivor says the practice brainwashed and changed her life forever. And there have been 6 stabbings on New York's subway just since Friday. In tonight's Local, a look at the spike in crime on trains in the city. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day, and because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. Out of our Northeast Bureau, at least 6 people have been stabbed in the New York City subway just over the weekend. The first attacks happened only hours after Mayor Eric Adams and the New York State governor announced a plan to try to stop violence on public transportation. Our NBC station in New York reports major crimes on transit are up 65% this year. From our Southwest Bureau, police in Colleyville, Texas, and the FBI are investigating an incident over the weekend as a hate crime because people in one neighborhood woke up to find plastic sandwich bags on their lawns, weighted down by rocks, and filled with anti-Semitic and anti-black messages. A little more than a month ago, remember, members of a Colleyville synagogue were taken hostage by a gunman. Similar flyers have been reported in places like Denver, San Francisco, and Miami. And our West Coast Bureau reporting on a huge 500-pound bear known as Hank the Tank. Hi, Hank, that's him. Breaking into homes around Lake Tahoe, becoming a big problem for locals. Officials say they've been trying to track and trap him. He's damaged something like 38 homes so far. Now, to tonight's original with in-depth reporting on a topic we've been keeping an eye on. Right now in New Hampshire, there's a bill that's advancing through the state legislature that looks to repeal the ban on conversion therapy for LGBTQ plus kids. The practice of trying to change someone's sexual orientation is banned in 20 states because of the higher rates of suicide among those who go through this, in heavy quotes here, treatment. Maura Barrett spoke to a survivor about the lifelong impact a program like this had on her.
I remember being, an early teenager with laying under the covers at night, praying and pleading with God that these feelings would go away.
Jessica Ritter knew from a relatively young age that she had feelings for women. Under pressure, she came out to her family in high school.
I just remember sobbing and telling them, I think I love a woman. They cried, I cried, and then we prayed. And then next day, the church leadership was at our house. Literally less than a week later, I was in conversion therapy 3 days a week.
The American Medical Association defines conversion therapy as any form of intervention that attempts to change someone's sexual orientation or behaviors. The way it's done can vary immensely, ranging from talk therapy, averse conditioning like electric shock or isolation, or even hypnosis.
I was actually in a small group of women ranging from 25 up to 69 or something, I think was the oldest lady. And it was people with sex addiction, drug addiction.
So your attraction to women was put in that same bucket as those
Correct.
things?
Yeah. There's the guilt of I had let my family down. And there was also this feeling of there's something wrong with me and I'm dirty.
Nearly 700,000 LGBTQ plus adults and an estimated 57,000 children today are survivors of conversion therapy. They're called survivors for a reason. A recent UCLA study found LGBTQ plus people who experience the practice are almost twice as likely to attempt suicide.
As its essence, conversion therapy is telling LGBT people, you're not good as you are, something that is, by the way, impossible to do, as those conversion therapies have never showed any success in actually, quote unquote, converting people's sexual orientations. I don't think it's ethical, but also it's never been successful.
For Jessica, the effects spiraled.
Was definitely an alcoholic for a good bit of time. Had one real suicide attempt that was pretty much ignored. Was diagnosed with depression by my conversion therapist and put on a lot of different medications. I think the most I was taking was 3 different antidepressant medications and then an anti-anxiety medication.
All at once?
All at once. So I ended up doing that for about 10 years.
The practice of conversion therapy on youth is banned in 20 U.S. states, but that's limited to licensed healthcare professionals. The laws do not cover religious or other providers. Federal legislation has been introduced in Congress to prohibit conversion therapy, but there's been no movement. Jessica, now 29 years old, is off those medications, in a successful relationship with her girlfriend, and seeing a new therapist to reverse what she calls brainwashing. She made the decision to cut off communication with her family.
Knowing what you know now, what would you say to younger you going through all this?
I would definitely want to tell myself that, one, you're going to be okay and life's going to be really beautiful, but it's going to be really hard. Who you are is enough, and God loves you, and there's going to be a group of people, your chosen family, that really love you. And a lot of what you're going to lose, you're going to gain so much more.
So Maura is joining us now. Maura, it's so emotional, to hear the conversations around this. And it's not just New Hampshire that's putting this conversion therapy back into the spotlight. Tell us more about what's happening in South Carolina, what we're seeing in different pockets of the country.
Well, South Carolina, similarly at a local level, is trying to repeal a ban that has been put into place. And like we mentioned in the piece there, 20 states do have this protection against LGBTQ youth. There's other states that have introduced bills, but that leaves 20 plus more states that have nothing, that say that this practice is okay, whether it's done by a licensed therapist or in a religious setting. And so something that Meyer, the researcher I spoke to, points out is that when you see this happening combined with the anti-trans bills, regarding sports in several states. We're looking at the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, the banning of LGBTQ plus books in libraries in certain states, all comes around the central idea that same-sex attraction, being in the LGBTQ community, is wrong. And that's incredibly damaging. That's the research that he was looking at. And so while you look at these bans and it says that a licensed therapist can't practice in those states, but a religious person can, there's the confusion around, whether or not it really is banned, right? But Meyer points out that the fact that there is a ban, there is a push for a federal ban in this sense, sends out the public messaging that this is so damaging, that from a human rights perspective, that this practice is wrong and can be so detrimental to people. Adding on to the fact that he mentioned there, and I want to emphasize that from a scientific standpoint, the conversion therapy, quote unquote, has never been successful. Right. Hallie.
Maura Barrett, thank you so much for your reporting. And we should note that if you are struggling or somebody you know is struggling, please know there is help. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 1-800-273-TALK. We'll be right back. We've got some breaking news just into us. We told you at the top of the show about the potential for Russia to send peacekeeping troops into the eastern part of Ukraine. We now have new reaction from the White House. I want to bring in NBC's Mike Memoli, who I believe is posted up for us now. Ma'am, you have some new reporting on this. What is the response from the White House?
Well, Hallie, first, significantly, this is the first extensive reaction we're getting from the Biden administration to all of the theatrics from Vladimir Putin today, both that Security Council meeting he held publicly for the cameras and also his address to the Russian people afterwards. A senior administration official calling Putin's speech an attack on the very idea of an independent Ukraine and saying it was a speech to the Russian people to justify a war. Now, what was interesting, and Hallie, I have to say, you've been on these calls with White House officials before. I've not been on one like this where there were reporters asking questions in real time about events being reported on the ground in real time. In this case, a report from Interfax that Russian units were literally rolling into eastern Ukraine. Now, this White House official said they were not going to react to press reports, but said suffice it to say that the White House was monitoring Russian actions very closely. But separately, to get back to a question and to a topic we were talking about with Matt Bodner earlier, what this White House official said that I found fascinating, because this all boils down to the question of what is an invasion. This official made the point that Russia has had military units on the ground in eastern Ukraine for years now. They just haven't acknowledged them in the past. So they made that point in, I thought, a very interesting way to make the argument that it's likely we might not necessarily see troops cross the border literally from Russia into Ukraine, that they might simply be activating Russian forces that are already on the ground. What that means in terms of what would trigger the sanctions posture that has long been promised by the West, by the United States and our allies, the official would not go on to say simply that they are not responding at this point to Russia's words, to Putin's words before moving forward. They are going to respond to their actions. And at this point, they have not assessed whether these quote unquote peacekeepers, we can call them, I think, invaders, are actually on the ground at this point.
Okay, so my question then, Mike, is it going to be a long night at the White House? Because I'm also looking at my email and not to get into, as a former member of the White House unit family, like the jargon around this, but there's been a lid, right, that's been called, which is typically the time when it signifies we will not see or hear in a visual capacity from the President of the United States after that point.
That's right, because we were talking about this earlier, the fact that the day ends with a lid, but it starts with a call time. And they kept pushing that call time back. At one point, it was at 6 o'clock, which is a few seconds from now. Interestingly, they were obviously making a decision behind the scenes about whether the president we're at the point where the president should speak. They were preparing for that point, but the lid that we just got in the last few minutes shows that they've clearly made the decision at this point that that's not going to happen tonight.
But obviously a lot of conversation with reporters, right? A lot of conversation about some of these developments. And I think it's late at night in Russia right now, right? I mean, it's, I think, past midnight or 1 a.m. or something. But it does mean that overnight we may see more developments, no?
That's right. And what was also of note was the official making it very clear that the sanctions that the White House has already announced, that the European Union has announced they intend to take in response to this recognition, I actually want to make sure I read it because there was some spicy language from time to time. They called it a recognition gambit, Potemkin politics. That was separate and apart from the more severe sanctions that they were still have been long promising. And so, again, 2 tracks of sanctions that are already in place. It's ready to go, one moving and one potentially still in the holster.
Mike Memoli, we may not see President Biden on camera again tonight, but I have a feeling we will be seeing your face on NBC News now. Mike, thank you for a great and a long day of reporting, I know. That does it for us this hour. We're going to have more for you here tomorrow. Same time, same place. It's good to have you with us. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.